In a small rural game store, I came across a Finecast Mad Dok Grotsnik. While Finecast has also been called Failedcast, Swinecast, Buy Other Cast, and F***cast, let's see how bad it actually is. Oh, hi everyone. Welcome to Mob Hammer 40k. I'm Mob. You know what I love about Warhammer is that Games Workshop has been around for decades, which means they have a bunch of miniatures just waiting to be found and discovered. Sure enough, at a local game shop, I looked behind some of the newer boxes of miniatures and I found in his complete Finecast glory, Mad Dok Grotsnik. I've never actually built or painted Finecast miniatures before, so this seemed like a really great opportunity to try something new, and plus, Mad Dok is out of print, so where else am I going to find him? Finecast was defined by its use of Finecast resin. Introduced in 2011, it was marketed as a much more lightweight and high-quality product meant to replace the metal cast miniatures of old. However, they were much more fragile and prone to breakage, presenting a whole new wealth of challenges for hobbyists. Apparently, when GW started making Finecast, they were using the original metallic molds, which weren't designed with Finecast in mind, and as such, there was a number of variations and problems and quality control issues that came up when they made them. As I've learned in the comments, the introduction of Finecast was the very reason a number of people left the hobby. Finecast is now discontinued and has left behind a fairly infamous legacy. But that means that there are a bunch of unopened Finecast miniatures all over the place, where if you're willing to put in the work, you can still find them. Anyways, let's get started on Grotsnik.
There are no included instructions, so I have to be extra careful not to accidentally cut off actual pieces of the model. Because of the Frankenstein nature of the figure, it can be even tricky to decipher what is excess resin or what is supposed to be part of it. While some is fairly obvious, for others I have to try and line it up with the connection points to be able to make a decision, using only these poor quality images as a reference to go off of. I also had to use matching details from the different components to make sure I properly lined them up. The other tricky thing with Finecast is that I need to rinse them off in warm water and remove any lingering resin dust. Otherwise, the paint and glue won't properly stick together. After letting it dry, I grab superglue. As patiently as I can, I get to constructing, trying to touch the miniature as little as possible, lest I get my fingers stuck together. Despite the annoying work, it's a really neat old school looking miniature, and I'm excited to get to painting it.
I wanted to try something different and start off with priming Grotsnik Gray. As you can see, I haven't used my gray primer in forever, and it turns out that when it gets separated, it gets a little bit red. After a good 10 minutes of shaking, I get proper coverage through my airbrush. It's a little tricky because the color isn't that different from the Finecast resin, so I have to be extra careful that I don't miss any pieces. Then, with Vallejo White Primer, I Zenithal highlight. Normally, I prime with black instead of gray, but I want it to be a little less contrasty with this paint job. With dark green, I start with the Orks skin base coat. Grotsnik's skin is gross. A lot of it is torn up and bolted to numerous metal pieces. Eventually, I would figure out what parts of him was supposed to be metal and which parts were supposed to be skin, but it took some time. Next, grabbing desert yellow, I base coat his pants, and then, with earth, his boots. Then, I like to go back and add a second coat of all the colors I've done so far. Now it's time to move on to metallics. I didn't have the right color I was looking for in my Vallejo set, so I used Iron Warriors from Citadel, taking a little more care to thin it down than I would with Vallejo. Grotsnik at this point is more metal than a biological creature. Grotsnik was originally an orc paintboy who did all sorts of questionable procedures, but rose to prominence when he created a new reinforced cranium for a young and injured Grotskul. I am not pronouncing that right. Within a week, Grotskul exhibited latent psychic powers that led to him becoming the leader of the Wag. Thus, many orcs sought out Grotsnik to perform the same procedure on them, now named the Grotskul Special. However, Grotsnik was eventually mutilated and left for dead at the hands of his patients when they learned he secretly implanted little trigger explosives in their newly installed craniums. His nurse Gretchen were able to revive him though, through unconventional and unsanitary means. This led to Grotsnik's revival, descent into further madness, and a rampage that left many orcs in the camp with exploded heads. What a cute backstory. Using Tinny Tin as another metallic color, I'm able to create a little more variety to sell that Grotsnik is just a bunch of scrap metal pieced together. Next, I move on to silver. Now, I know I said I want to make him look scrappy, but I've got plans for how to paint his blaster, so stay with me. While letting that dry, I grab simple black and paint in his belt very carefully. As careful as I can. It's tricky, okay? Now with Scarlet Red, we paint in the tubing on Grotsnik's back, just to add a little bit of variety. I use the same Scarlet Red to paint in the lens of his artificial eye, as well as what remains of his crazy brain. With the appropriately named Dead White, I take a first pass at painting his apron? It's certainly a stylistic choice. At this point, I decided I actually need to look at some reference images on the internet, and I realized there are some more surfaces covered in flesh than I thought, so I paint over what I think makes sense, again, with dark green. Going back to silver, I carefully go through and add dots of colors to the bolts and screws found throughout the miniature. Just makes it pop a little bit. Now with Express Color Plasma Red mixed in 3 to 2 parts Express Medium, I paint over the silver Orc blaster. It goes on fairly thick, but once it dries it comes together nicely. Now, I know I should have done this sooner, but I decided to use my little electric drill to make a hole in the barrel. This will require a little additional cleanup and painting, but the final result is worth it. Going back to silver again, I add little colored accents as well as paint in some of the details. With Goblin Green, I paint this little wiring that's on the blaster, just giving it a nice little touch. Now that our base coat is complete, it's time to get a little technical. Using Technical Art Coat, I apply a glossy varnish all over the miniature. This will help to protect the undercoat as well as help my impeding oil wash flow into the crevices of the Mini. I gave this 2 hours to dry, deciding to go out for a bike ride and catch up with a friend. Just wanted to make sure that this varnish held well as enjoy what was a really beautiful day outside. Hey guys, just a quick word from our sponsor, me. That's right. I'm not selling anything, but you know what? If you like what you're seeing, please like, subscribe, comment, and share this video with any of your friends you think might enjoy it. I'm not making any money off this. I do this all for fun, and I paint, shoot, and edit all these videos myself, so any little bit of positive encouragement goes a far way. Anyways, let's get back to the video. Coming back, the varnish has sealed well, and the Mini looks super glossy. With Streaking Grime enamel paint from AK Interactive, I just completely and utterly cover the miniature in this stuff. Then I decide to let it sit and dry for another hour. Grotsnik is looking pretty darn dirty, and that's great. Taking an old t-shirt, I wipe off as much of the enamel paint as I can over the larger surfaces, and then I use a Q-tip to get some of the smaller areas. Honestly, you may want to get a little makeup swabs instead of the Q-tips so that your miniature doesn't look so hairy, but I didn't find the cleanup too crazy. Then, with my Gamsol Mineral Spirits, I dip my Q-tips in and continue to erase the enamel paint to my desired level. Afterwards, I show my fiance my progress to get a read on what she thinks of the miniature, and she had this to say.
Oh my god!
What?
What? Turn him around.
What?
Why is his ass so juicy?
Yeah, that ass is pretty juicy.
What the f?
Moving on. Grabbing AK Interactive's Ultra Matte Finish, it's time to dull down the Mini. The glossiness as it stands just doesn't work, and it's not very realistic considering the orc flesh. This was my second time applying this varnish. Although I used different colors, the steps that I used to paint Grotsnik was very similar to how I painted the Warhammer Mini of the Month, the Free Guild Steel Helm. Glossing him up, oil washes, then dulling him down with a matte varnish, and then from there, building up layer upon layer of colors. Ended up giving me some really good results, and gave me the confidence to try and do the same with Grotsnik. So let's get to it. Grabbing Goblin Green, we begin to bring back the vibrancy to the Orc's green skin. With Bloody Red, I build up the highlights along the back tubing, the artificial camera eye, and the Orc Shuta. Oh, and I almost forgot his brain. Going back to all of my original colors before the oil wash, I just apply a layer of highlights to everything. Taking the green skin highlights another step further, I add Moot Green. Let me know in the comments if you think it went a little too bright. My SO said it looked a little too cartoony, but I kinda like it. And if you think that went too far, I mix some more Dead White with Moot Green and add just a touch of highlights in some more places. With Orange Fire, it was time to add Grotsnik stitches. I like to think story-wise that these have to change out quite frequently, so they're fairly bright in color. Now, this is when the detail of the Finecast minis started to get a little tricky. The stitches are incredibly small, and I found that I kind of wanted to add more of them, or I couldn't find them all. So I ended up painting in some more stitches than I could actually see. And you know what? I think it works. With silver, I go back and highlight more of the bolts, as well as some of the edges. Back with dead white, I paint in his one good eye as well as the little flare on his lens. As a challenge for myself, I saw reference images on the internet that show a little gauge on Grotsnik's stomach. I haven't really painted anything that small before, but I thought I'd give it a shot. It was pretty easy once I decided to add it in steps from red to orange to green. Then I did my best to paint in a little tiny arrow indicator. I hope you can see it. I felt really close now, but I wasn't liking his apron, so I grabbed bone white, well watered down, and did a layer over the entire thing. Then I add some light highlights using dead white. Taking a messy brush loaded up with thinned down bloody red, I flicked onto his apron to create a blood splatter effect, and lightly touched it to fill in some more of the space. For the final step, I added Martian iron crust to the base and painted a neat black around the edge. Alright, so I lied, guys. That was actually not the last step. To be honest, I shot the final reveal footage of this mini, and as I looked at it, I felt like there was some details missing that wasn't quite right. So one morning, I got up, I grabbed some Nuln Oil and the smallest brush I could find, and I basically used it to just a tiny, tiny little bit of Nuln Oil to fill in some of the grooves of the muscle on Grotsnik, as well as fill in a little more shading around his stitches. And I fixed up his face a little bit. It was just something where I didn't know if it was going to work, but without having the pressure of having to film it on camera, it gave me a little bit more creative freedom to experiment and play around. And it just goes to show that even though you start painting a miniature, even though it may not be exactly perfect, you can always experiment, play around a little bit, and you never know what might come of it. So I always encourage you to, like, if you're not completely satisfied with your miniature or your painting, feel free to keep tweaking. It's always good to keep experimenting because worst comes to worst, you learn from your mistakes, and in the best case, you end up improving upon the miniature and learning that you can always grow and become a better painter. Anyways, let's look at the final video.